Do-do, do-do, do-do. Guess what I have? This is called a gospel book, and it's the book I use on any given Sunday when I step in front of the congregation to proclaim the gospel. So today on That Deacon on YouTube, I'm going to be talking about the form and function of how a deacon, at least this deacon, proclaims the gospel on any given Sunday on That Deacon on YouTube. I'm sure you know what this book is. It's the Book of Common Prayer. And in the Book of Common Prayer, there are certain things called rubrics. Now, a rubric, I'm not sure the origin of the word, but I do know it means read, because the directions that we see in italics in any given prayer book that gives directions were in red at some point in our church history. So basically, rubrics are stage directions or other instructions that are written in a prayer book. Now, the second interesting thing about a rubric is that you will notice at certain times there may be commas for certain things. For example, here it says, a psalm, hymn, or anthem may follow each reading. So we have three different suggestions: a psalm, hymn, or anthem. Usually, almost specifically, the first choice is a preferred choice in the prayer book. So if you're looking through a prayer book, always look at the first suggestion, because that is the primary suggestion that the prayer book gives. It doesn't mean you have to do it. It's just showing you the preferred order. For example, when we get to the portion that has to do with the lessons and the gospel. So here it says, then all standing, the deacon or a priest reads the gospel. At first saying, and then it gives what we say. But the very first person mentioned in the prayer book is the deacon, because that is one of the functions of the deacon in the Eucharist service, to proclaim the gospel. Here's another interesting fact. I don't know what you do at your church, but when we get to the Eucharist portion, after the Sanctus, after the Holy, 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 then it says, as the celebrant continues to bless the elements that are on the altar, it says the people stand or kneel. So did you know that the prayer book first suggests you stand at Eucharist and not kneel? Kneeling usually was done in the early church only during Lent, only during a penitent season. Typically, people stood, and that's what our prayer book suggests. The people stand or kneel. So if you're watching this video and you happen to get your hands on a Book of Common Prayer, read the rubrics one day. You'll find them quite fascinating. While I'm at it, I'd like to share another interesting factoid of trivia or of church history. But going way back, probably to the Byzantine Rite. The deacon, of course, proclaimed the gospel, but they did something very interesting with their hands. And I have tried in vain to find a picture on the internet to back up what I was taught, just as an aside as well. But many times the deacon, when proclaiming the gospel, would raise their hands, let me see, it's like this or like this, but they would keep their hands out, mainly because the deacon represents the angel in the service. Angels were messengers. So when the deacon in the Orthodox Rite would proclaim the gospel, they would raise their hands up. Of course, there would be an acolyte or a person holding the gospel book, but they would raise their hands like this to proclaim the gospel as though they were an angel. And I think that's quite fascinating that the deacon represented the messenger, and messengers biblically were always angels, so they would give this stance. When a deacon is going to proclaim the gospel, you have to do a few things ahead of time, at least I do. Of course, I look up what the reading is going to be, and then as you saw, I have my own printout, as you can see, that I attach. There you see, with my paper clips, you can see that I attach it in my gospel so I can give an effective reading. I don't know if any of you have actually taken a look at the gospel book. This is the book a priest or a deacon uses to proclaim the gospel that has the propers all set out. But the main thing you notice is, look at this. There are no paragraphs. It's just one long string of words on a page. And I think they do this just to save space. But it can become very difficult to read. And the whole goal of the gospel proclamation is to make sure it is understood by those attending the service. And so what I like to do is kind of make a new version of the gospel each Sunday that allows me to proclaim the gospel clearly and in a way that will make sense to people attending the service. So it helps me to reformat the text so that it could be read and proclaimed in a much better light. But even before I practice the words, I sit down and I do a very short and cursory exegesis of the gospel reading. So I totally understand what the context is to that particular reading on any given Sunday. And I try to get the notion of what the teaching is, but here's the trick. I have learned over the years to not punch any particular teaching that I think is important, especially if I'm not preaching. If I'm not preaching, I normally don't know what the celebrant or the preacher, if we have a guest preacher, is going to focus upon. So I really can't punch anything when I get to a particular passage. For example, I'm using the reading from last week because it was very short. But let me just show you how I could do it incorrectly. So let's say that I wanted to focus on where I am going, you cannot come. And that is not what the preacher is going to preach about. But you can see how important it is for the deacon to keep a very level proclamation when you're proclaiming the gospel. At the Last Supper, when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And as I said to the crowd, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." Now, you notice I stressed you cannot come. Then I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. You see, I read that punching one particular area of the proclamation while I softened the other. You don't really want to do that as a deacon. You have to read it all, I think, with a slight animation because you're proclaiming it to the people, but at the same time, you can't put too much stress on one particular area. Now you notice there are all these words without paragraphs or anything. And one reason that I like to split up the paragraph by adding a blank between thoughts is so I can give people a chance to let what I've said sink in and then start a new thought. And I usually have to go through the reading to make sure that I understand where that thought ends and something new begins. So I will give only a slight pause between the first train of thought and the second. So as I said before, you will look for me. And as I said to the crowd, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have. See, and then you see I go on. It's just a slight pause so that people could realize that that thought is ended and there's a new thought beginning that will take us through it. It's not a long pause, but it's enough to give a little bounce to the next section. Now, lastly, the other thing that I do is that at the very end, and I don't know why I do this, it's just something I started doing over time, usually gospel readings end with a little aphorism, a pithy quote. Just like a couple weeks ago, after this he said to him, "Follow me," is how the gospel ends. But what I tend to do is say something like this. He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." Did you see what I did? The very last few words, I close the book and say those words. I can usually remember them because they're pretty simple. It's nothing that dramatic. But typically, when I am proclaiming the gospel, I have my head in the book. I don't look up and look at people like I'm giving a speech. I am proclaiming the gospel of the Lord, which means that I don't want to necessarily stand out at that moment. I want to be able to concentrate, make sure I get the words right that are in front of me, and then at the very end, just to bring us back into the fold of an entire congregation and me proclaiming it to the people, with the people. I will say the last few words while closing the book. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. The gospel of the Lord. See how I do that. So I will speak the very last line, the very last few words. I close the book. I raise the book, say the gospel of the Lord. Another thing I do, which I was not taught, and it just came naturally from me, when I say the gospel of the Lord, and when people say thanks be to God, I lower the book and I do a slight bow to them, to the people around me or to the congregation. I don't know why I do that. It just sort of naturally happened. It's not a grand stance, but when I say, let me step back here, when I say the gospel of the Lord, and then I give a little bow. Sometimes I'm out there by myself. Other times I have acolytes. It just depends who is serving that Sunday. Sometimes I will hand the book back to the acolyte and they step by and I follow the crucifer back to where we placed the gospel book. But it's something, that little nod is just something that sort of comes naturally from me. So it's just something I do. So I hope that you enjoyed my little talk today about how to proclaim the gospel and how I tend to do it as a deacon. I'm sure you will find many other different variations from any number of deacons out there doing this on Sunday. At our particular church, we don't use incense, even though I have gone out to other places and I have incensed the gospel book. We don't do it here on Sundays, so I don't have to deal with that. It's nice when it happens, but the most important thing is making the text known and keeping it somewhat stable so you don't touch any area that could be in possible conflict with the person preaching, and to make sure that you give enough time for people to grasp the meaning and the overall arch of the reading, so that then the person who is preaching the gospel message doesn't fight against your own personal interpretation, which sometimes you feel you know exactly what it's about. Well, you have to pull yourself back from that and make sure that everyone hears the words and give them time to let them soak in. So I think I've got everything. If I missed something, let me know down in the box below. By the way, YouTube has changed their policies a little bit. So if you would like to know of my next video that is coming out, make sure not only that you subscribe, but that you hit the little bell. You will see a little bell down here. I think it's over here on your screen. And if you hit that bell, you will receive an email from my channel letting you know that I have uploaded a new video. But until next time, that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. God bless. Be well. And go out in the world and make a little bit of difference. Let people know that you are a happy, helpful soul. Bye-bye.